All right, so in this video, I'm going to give you a kind of crash course on bivariate mapping. This is a technique that I've been doing for quite a while. I've actually wrote my master's thesis on this technique back in a while ago. So 2012, I guess now. So anyway, this will go through considerations, thoughts about choropleth mapping, how to do the bivariate technique, and then how to decipher the legend. So, kind of get you through the process of turning this choropleth map into a more interesting and dynamic visualization that shows two variables simultaneously and the relationship between those two variables. And then from there, give you some flexibility on what data you want to represent, how you want to represent, or how you want to visualize that, color palettes, etc. Okay, so if we think about a choropleth map here, right, we have our field is population density, and then we have 5 classes, and it's a natural breaks data classification. If we look at our histogram, we can see natural breaks just kind of arbitrarily putting a value here, but most of our data is like chunked up in this bin here. And this is pretty common of large, sparsely populated counties. Then we have clusters of high population areas in the urban areas, right? And then in the rest of these areas around Eureka and Arcade and McKinleyville specifically, right? We have kind of uniform low population density. Um, and so, most of the time we always want to normalize by population density, just because that gives us a better sense of like how the population is situated and it's not being influenced by the size of the boundary units that we use, right? And so like if all population is fairly uniform across spaces, and then the size of the container itself will influence how many people are in that container, right? Um, so this is more common in like suburban areas or in the Midwest that has the township and range system where there's just a little bit more uniformity across the landscape. Whereas in the mountainous West, where there's like these large counties with these large census tracts with sparsely populated areas, we end up getting data that looks more like this, right? More skewed data. So in this situation, we could potentially go to just total population. This gives us a little bit more of a normal distribution of data. So that's one consideration to make is, most of the time I want to normalize my data, but is the population dynamics of the place I'm mapping lend itself to just looking at raw counts instead? Okay, and if we look at raw counts here, we could change this to 3, for instance, right? And we could change this to quantile. And then now what we're essentially getting is a map of census tracts that show low, medium, and high values of population, right? So this set here, and this is putting the same number of observations in each bin, right? So we get a lower third, a middle third, and an upper third of population across this landscape. And that can be helpful in understanding kind of these different bins or these different kind of breaks in the data, right? Where's our low values? Where's our medium values? Where's our high values? Okay, so we have that in 3 classes. Now let's change this from graduated colors to bivariate colors. And what we're getting now is 2 different data fields and a 3x3 legend, right? And we don't really want to go higher than this. If we were to go 4x4, for instance, and it starts to get pretty convoluted, trying to read these values is pretty difficult. If we go to 3x3, that allows us to see on this grid over here, right? Here's low, medium, high values of this variable. Here's low, medium, high values of this variable. So what I always do when I'm doing bivariate mapping is I have 2 variables, a 3x3 grid size, quantile method of distribution, so that way I know that my grid, that there's going to be 1/3 of my data in this column, 1/3 in this column, 1/3 in this column. And on the vertical axis, there's going to be 1/3 of the data in this row, 1/3 in this row, 1/3 in this row. And then I can see what that relationship is between those two variables, right? Okay, so let's say we wanted to look at our relationship between population and the second cluster of data here, this wildfire hazard score. And for the wildfire hazard potential score, let's go to median, right? And so that's saying, essentially, we're looking at this white to kind of teal color here. That's the horizontal axis, right? This is low, this is medium, and this is high wildfire hazard potential score. Okay, so this whole row is that. This whole row is medium. This whole row is high. And then we could layer on top of that the population density, or the population. So low population, medium population, high population. So essentially what this is saying is each of these different grids, we can coordinate what of those areas are low, 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 high, high, low, etc. So the corners are really the most important pieces of this to help understand the grid and how it works. So let's take a look at a few examples. Okay, so let's go on the bottom grid here. And these areas here in the dark, or in the teal to dark blue, those are our places of high wildfire potential, right? And we can see here, from that, we don't really have any of this data classification. We don't have this. So all of our areas of high wildfire potential in Humboldt County are all the areas that are low population, which makes sense, right? That's the kind of more mountainous, more forested lands that have low population, where most of our population is clustered around the coastal areas. So if we go to medium population, then we can start to see some areas that have different ranges of types of wildfire potential. So these medium ranges here, right? We know that's predominantly redwood. These ones here, this middle one, that's this chunk spot here, right? And then high would be some of these areas here. And just to get a little bearing, let's look on this imagery. Let me see where this stuff is. Right, so we can see, right here's a spot that has medium population density, medium wildfire hazard potential. And that's, up in this, up here, north of McKinleyville, between McKinleyville and Trinidad. Down here, right? Medium population density, or no, high population density, medium wildfire risk, right? And that's this area here, McKinleyville, so on and so forth. Right, so these purple areas are really kind of the ones that stand out the most in this map as being the areas that have the highest potential wildfire risk and also are more populated areas. And if we look at the pink, for instance, those are high population areas that have low risk, right? So that'd be Arcata, Eureka, etc. Okay, so that's how the bivariate map works. Let's open back up the symbology. Oops. Okay, and we can change these variables. This is kind of what you are able to do. You can use this population wildfire relationship if you want. You can change this to some other sort of demographic characteristics that you might find more interesting. So let's say we're more interested in housing units and like total amount of infrastructure, housing infrastructure, right? We can change that, and then we still have that mixed with wildfire risk. And there we might see, oh, there's actually like these higher levels of risk down here, right? Where there's less population, but there's a large amount of housing infrastructure, right? This is an area that people have cabins, second homes, other things like that, right? There's no apartments. All these are like single family houses that people live down here. Whereas, in places like this, right, there is high amount of housing units, right? Because there's more people that live here, but there's low risk. So that might be one that you want to use. You might want to look at housing affordability index and see how that changes, right? Now we see something that's interesting. HOOPA, high wildfire risk, high housing affordability index. So mess around with one of these, or mess around with these variables. What you want to do is on your one axis have one of these demographic variables, right? Per capita, diversity index, population, whatever you want that one axis to be. And then the second one, just keep it at this mean wildfire hazard score. Just as I think, or this median, because that's just, I think, a good measure of general risk, right? Of wildfire risk. Keep the grid 3x3, keep it quantile, so you have that high, medium, and low value on each of your two axes. And then you can, mess around with the colors you want. You want to avoid one like this, right? This is a dual bivariate legend, right? So you have low, medium, and high. This is what you'd use more for like standard deviation, where you're trying to white out or minimize the middle values and highlight the extreme values. So color palette here, I would just use one of these pre-stocked ones. I wouldn't try to make your own. And then down here, you could change the orientation around if you wanted to. Make it into a diamond. Maybe like that. That diamond looks pretty good, actually. Kind of like that. But however you want to do it. And then, you can label. So this will determine how the legend looks. So I'll let you mess around with how you want to label this legend, etc. So that is how you do the bivariate mapping. I will kind of walk through the instructions as well in text format. And so, yeah, good luck. It's an interesting technique. One of my favorite techniques, but one that sometimes kind of breaks your brain a little bit. You have to kind of figure out what you're trying to map and what exactly your map's saying. But then once you get it to say the story you want it to say, it can be a really powerful way of comparing those two different types of data that you have in your field.